On a rural stretch of road in Ohio, two hikers made a gruesome discovery.
Call was reference a cooler with a bad smell coming from it.
The smell lingering from that cooler was the body of a 28-year-old, but that's not all.
It was also discovered that she was pregnant and the baby was also deceased.
Who could be behind this horrific crime? Well, police arrested two men, but you'll never believe what they claimed happened to 28-year-old Brittany Fuhr-Storms. Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. Investigators traced Brittany's last known whereabouts to a home where one of the suspects lived. And from the description police gave of that home, you might liken it to a drug den. But if this case wasn't shocking enough, police say she was likely dead a week before her body was disposed of, as if she was just trash.
Everybody dropped everything, as they should when you find out that a mother-to-be was just dumped on the side of the road.
That was Jackson Township police describing the moments their officers found Brittany Fuhr-Storms dead in a closed plastic tote. According to reports, two hikers made that discovery while walking along the road in Jackson Township, Ohio. One hiker called it into 911 and reportedly said, "I didn't want to open it. The smell was so bad, you know. I know there's a difference between dead smells, and that is not a normal dead smell."
There's a lot of people that are down there on foot. It's adjacent to a Metro Park ground. There's a creek there as well. So they were walking allegedly down the roadway when they smelled something, and that's when they called 911.
Or will you go back to the map just so they know? When we keep saying, you won't see this on some of the maps, but this is Manning going into Anthony. But the right side going up on this gravel is still considered Fort Anthony Road. So when you guys keep hearing Fort Anthony Road, that's what we're talking about. And this is the area or approximate location where the body was located.
And whoever put Brittany inside that plastic tote went to great lengths to conceal her body.
Sunday, August the 3rd, 2025, approximately 1937 hours, Jackson Township Police Department was dispatched to a suspicious circumstance on Fort Anthony Road in Jackson Township, Montgomery County, Ohio. The call was reference a cooler with a bad smell coming from it. At that time, they called for German Township because one of our crews was tied up. German Township got there, was able to get the tote up over the dirt hill that was behind. And at that time, they were able to get the lid off of it and noticed that there was a nude female inside. Once the tote was open, she was wrapped in towels and a tarp. The plastic tote had screws keeping the lid down tight. And that's at that time we secured the scene and called Montgomery County Sheriff's Office for their evidence techs and homicide detectives to come up and assist in the investigation.
This case was a little tricky, too. It led investigators across different agencies. First, Jackson Township, where Brittany was discovered. That's about 30 miles south of Akron, Ohio, by the way. Then Montgomery County, Ohio, 3 hours southeast from Jackson Township. And then finally around the corner to Middletown, Ohio, where the two suspects were arrested, James Rothenbusch and Rick Sheppard.
James and another person of interest, Rick Sheppard, left Brittany's body in the shower of the home for several days before putting her body in the tote and driving it out to Fort Anthony Road located in Jackson Township and disposing of the body.
There's several questions here already running through my mind. How did a pregnant Brittany find herself in that home? Who were James and Rick to her? And the obvious question, what happened? Here's what we do know. Investigators say Brittany died of suspicious circumstances while at James's home. But so far, neither James or Rick are charged with murder, just gross abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence, plus other charges.
Mr. Rothenbusch, he was later booked on the following charges, which is corrupting another with drugs, which is a felony of the first degree, tampering with evidence, a felony of the third degree, gross abuse of a corpse, felony of the fifth degree, trafficking in drugs, felony of the third degree, possession of drugs, felony of the third degree, failure to report a crime or death, misdemeanor 4, and possession of drug paraphernalia, which is also a fourth degree misdemeanor. A second person of interest, which was Mr. Rick Sheppard, was located later at 608 Baltimore Street in our city. Sheppard attempted to flee from officers, but he was quickly apprehended and detained.
Let me ask you guys something. How much time do you think your business team is wasting buried in spreadsheets, chasing down receipts, and reconciling endless rows of bank statements? Yeah, probably a little too much. That's where Odoo Accounting steps in. Odoo gives users a clean, modern accounting dashboard that shows you exactly what you need. Your bank balances, cash flow, vendor bills, customer invoices, all of that is in one place. It's intuitive, easy to navigate, and for anyone managing their business's accounting, it's invaluable. You want to know why Odoo will give your business a cutting edge? Odoo uses smart AI with a 98% recognition rate to automatically generate invoices and vendor bills. So all you have to do is just review and validate, and that's it. And their bank reconciliation is next level. Odoo connects with over 28,000 banks to automatically match your transactions with your financial records to give you pinpoint accuracy, so no more guesswork. Need reports? Well, Odoo's got everything from your balance sheet to your cash flow statements professionally formatted and instantly accessible. So if you've been doing all of this accounting work manually, you can stop this instant. Automate invoices, vendor bills, and accounting workflow with Odoo today. Get a free 15-day trial today at www.odoo.com/LCNewsAccounting and see what your business has been missing with Odoo. Rick Sheppard allegedly told police he and James didn't kill Brittany, but that Brittany died from a drug overdose. James allegedly told investigators in his police interview Brittany died under suspicious circumstances and admitted to keeping her body in his home for days, meaning no calls to 911, to police, to no one. They just left her body until they allegedly decided to put her in a plastic tote, seal the tote, and dump it on the side of the road. And if that isn't bad enough, police say both men knew she was pregnant. When police executed a search warrant on James's home, police reportedly found a horror scene. Bloodstains on the carpet, screws, a blue tarp, and towels that matched the description of the ones wrapped around Brittany's body. But so much right now is unknown. And it's not the first time either Rick Sheppard or James Rothenbusch had brushes with the law. According to a report by Dayton 24/7, James had 33 criminal charges in Middletown going back the past 20 years. And most charges stem from burglary, theft, and drugs. Rick Sheppard had about 25 criminal charges, many of those also drug-related. But could murder be added to their rap sheet? It depends. Investigators are waiting for the autopsy results to come back before deciding if James and Rick will face more charges. I'm joined now by former homicide detective, that's Sergeant John Rappa. Thank you so much for joining me. What's your reaction to this case? I mean, a young pregnant woman, she's found in a plastic tote. The two suspects claim she died of a drug overdose, but do you really buy that?
So, first of all, it's horrific when you think of the way they discarded her like trash out there by the, where they found her, and then the way they found her. But following the case, honestly, it's a little too hard to tell whether it's going to be a homicide or whether it's going to be a drug overdose. When you look at the history of these two guys, it really seems like it's plausible that it could have been an overdose.
And it's interesting, too, because I think one of the suspects claimed that he was guilty of drug trafficking. Allegedly, he had said that to police, but then he kind of was mum in terms of whether or not that the victim was killed or not. And, it was interesting, the circumstances kind of surrounding the scene at the home. There's blood stains in the home, there's screws found, there's towels. The victim obviously found inside that tote, and she was found nude inside that tote. In your opinion, if this was a drug overdose, why go through the lengths to dispose of her body in just such a horrific manner as opposed to just calling the cops and telling her something terrible happened?
That's a good question. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've worked narcotics in the past. I worked undercover. I was assigned to the DEA task force, and I worked homicide for many years. And one of the things that I noticed is when people overdose, the drug dealers are afraid of getting in trouble for selling drugs. So obviously, their drugs, their narcotics enterprise was more important than this poor girl's life. And so if it was in fact a drug overdose, it's not uncommon for people to try to cover that up.
Tell me a little bit about an investigation like this. It spanned different counties, different areas up in Ohio. What's it like working kind of in this kind of cross-directional or promotional way when you're working with all these different agencies to get to the bottom of what happened to this poor girl?
Sure. First of all, I got to tell you, I thought the interagency cooperation was phenomenal. The limited knowledge I have on the case, because it's coming out and we're learning facts as it comes out, I thought they did a phenomenal job. One agency is speaking to the other agency. And what I found interesting was that one of the agencies was already investigating these two for drug trafficking. They were in the middle of an investigation when this came up. So talk about putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. Sometimes it's hard to work with other agencies. Sometimes egos get in the way. And then, other times just, with the training, there's different levels of training. There's different levels of experience. I find that I'm very fortunate in the kinds of investigations we've worked in the past. I find that when agencies can really, put the egos to the side and work together, and I think that happens more often than not. If you watch the movies, they're always fighting, right? They're always arguing and bickering. Absolutely. But I think what happens is more often than not, the agencies do come together because there's one common goal, and that's to find out what happened to Brittany and get justice for Brittany.
And, while investigators are still kind of going through the details, one thing that also stands out to me is that both of these men knew that Brittany was pregnant. But I'm curious kind of how she came to know these men. Maybe it was because possibly and allegedly, again, we don't know the full extent of the investigation right now and what investigators know. But in terms of maybe she went over there to possibly purchase drugs, maybe she knew them as friends, maybe it's kind of unclear. But with the information that we know now, do you think that it's possible maybe she was lured there? She went willingly? What are your thoughts on how she even arrived to that home, knowing that both of these men, both of these suspects in custody, knew that she was weeks along in her pregnancy?
Sure. Again, that's an interesting question, and that's hard to determine at this stage. One thing that I found interesting was the police did not call it overdose just yet. During the press conference, they called it a suspicious death, right? It hasn't been deemed an overdose yet. It could be a homicide. It could be an overdose. They're still waiting toxicology reports. So without speculating too much, I think it's feasible because of their lifestyle, because of what the police found in the house, that they are drug dealers. If you look at their history, there's history of drug trafficking, drug sales. I think it's very plausible that she did go over there, whether as a friend or whether just a party or whether to make a purchase. And obviously drugs were consumed in the house. If in fact she did overdose. Now, of course, something more nefarious could be at play here, but they won't know that until the toxicology comes back and the death report and so forth.
And how important is an autopsy report in a case like this where, investigators and police are obviously waiting until they get that autopsy report back to decide whether or not more charges will be added to, their rap sheet or anything like that. But in terms of how important that autopsy report is, how important is it?
It's one of the most important things right now because you can't charge somebody with overdose if they don't have high levels or, overdose levels of drugs in their system. I know there was fentanyl found in the house. So if they find that she died of a fentanyl overdose, well, that could back up the claims of the two suspects. But if there's not, well, then there's something more nefarious at play. So right now, I think that toxicology report and the full autopsy report is paramount in finding out what happened.
And in terms of just the seriousness of the allegations they still face at this point, and that being having to deal with drugs, tampering with a corpse, all of that stuff, I understand that for the most part, it's not as serious as it sounds as maybe murder, but it is still pretty serious charges. Talk to me a little bit about like tampering with evidence, tampering with a corpse, and how that kind of compares and contrasts to like a murder charge, for example.
Sure. So from what I understand, and I don't work in Ohio, but from what I understand, in Ohio, tampering with a corpse, I'm not sure the specific name for it, but I believe it's gross abuse of a corpse. That's a 5th degree felony. Obviously, that's not going to carry the same punishment weight as murder would or manslaughter charge would. I believe it's punishable, and I could be wrong here, but I believe it's punishable by a few years in prison. It's a 5th degree felony, and I think it's one of the lowest felonies Ohio has. So it's not even close to the spectrum of what they're going to be charged if they get charged with a homicide or something to that effect. Now, just because she overdoses, it does not mean they can't be charged with a homicide, or manslaughter for that fact. Oftentimes, states are now prosecuting drug dealers for supplying drugs to somebody if they can connect, if they can show a nexus between the drugs that they supplied and that person's death, that person's overdose. They can't upgrade the charges to manslaughter. So even if they don't find that they purposely murdered somebody, if in fact they can connect the drugs, if they can show that she did have an overdose and they can show that nexus, there's a strong possibility they could upgrade the charges to involuntary manslaughter.
And are you surprised how forthcoming the suspects were in their police interview in terms of just kind of copping to the whole drug trafficking aspect of it? But when it came to whether or not they had killed Brittany Fuhr, it was always no, she died of a drug overdose. But then you have that other aspect of them disposing of her body just like common trash. I just can't get over that part. But what are your thoughts overall on that?
So oftentimes in interviews, suspects are going to minimize their involvement. And whether they're being honest at this point or not. When I say honest, I mean honest to the point of did they murder her? So let's just assume at this point they're being honest. It's a lot easier to say, yeah, she died of an overdose and we discarded of the body rather than we murdered her. So obviously they know the police are there for a reason. They know they've been caught. And one reason why people confess, guilty suspects confess, is they know they've been caught. That's why showing evidence is so strategic and so powerful during an interview or an interrogation. And so I think at this point, when they sit down, and I haven't watched the interview, I'd love to, but when they sit down and they watch and they conduct an interview with the suspects and they say, hey, this is what we have. We have A, B, and C. Sometimes a suspect has no choice but to say, okay, this is what happened. Now, whether it's true or not, it's easier to minimize their involvement. It's easier to say she died of a drug overdose. And as horrific as it is to put her in a tote, in a storage tote, to nail it shut, to discard her on the side of the road like trash, it's easier to admit to that than it is we murdered somebody and then did that to her. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's truly just horrible overall what she went through. I think in any possible scenario, it's just a horrible case overall. But I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this case. Now, if you had a crystal ball, do you expect murder charges to possibly be coming down the line?
That's all dependent on the district attorney's office. I'm not sure how that DA works over there. I could say that I would expect it if they're on the ball and they're doing their job, at least an involuntary manslaughter charge of some sort, if in fact there was an overdose involved, and they can show that nexus. I do believe that.
I guess we'll have to see how that all continues to play out, as we'll be following this case pretty closely. I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this case. Again, I appreciate your time so much today.
Thank you so much.
Officials say the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office in Ohio will be handling the investigation moving forward. And again, pending the autopsy, James Rothenbusch and Rick Sheppard could face additional charges. Thanks so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner.